I am Steve Cousins. I'm chairman of Associated Industries of Arkansas, and I'd like to introduce Stephen Moore, who's our featured speaker.
Well, good afternoon, folks. It is a great privilege to be here in Arkansas. You must be so thrilled that you get to hear from an economist, right? You know economists, right? We're people who are very good with numbers who didn't quite have the personality to be accountants. So it is fun to be here. First of all, I just have to say this. I do a lot of work with national groups and the politicians in Washington, and I do a lot of work with the governors and state legislatures across America. And, I'm a conservative Republican, I'll say that from the outset, but I've got to say, Governor Beebe has been one of the really great governors in America. And I think the governor may have left, but it's just amazing. And we really could use people like him who have the kind of pro-business, common sense Democrats. And quite frankly, there just aren't enough of those in Washington right now. And, you have a tradition in Arkansas of your governors becoming president. And I would love to, wouldn't it be wonderful to see Mr. Beebe run for president right now? I would just love to see that as the next step. So, all right. So let me just tell you one quick story about something that happened this was about 2 weeks ago. I'm on the road all the time, and I was at a hotel, and I was on the exercise bike in the morning, and so I turned on C-SPAN. I'm a kind of political junkie, and I don't know how many of you saw this, but the president was in Ohio, and he was giving a talk about his education agenda, and he was in the schoolroom with a bunch of teachers and a bunch of school children, and they looked like they were about, 10, 11, 12 years old, third, fourth, fifth graders, and he, at one point, after he gave his prepared remarks, he turned to the kids in the room. I don't know how many of you saw this, and he said, "Well, I wonder if there are any questions from the children." And I kind of perked up when I saw this. I couldn't wait to see, what these kids might say. And the president said, "Do any of the children have questions?" And this little boy in the front of the room is, wildly waving his hand. And the president says, "Son, what is your name?" And the little boy says, "Well, Mr. President, my name is Oliver." "Well, Oliver, what is your question this morning?" And Oliver says, "Well, Mr. President, I just wonder if you have any reservations about what happened in Benghazi." And do you think maybe you could have acted a little more swiftly and maybe saved the lives of our ambassador and our embassy personnel? And, you can see President Obama, he's kind of taken back by this. And then the little boy says, and I just had another question, Mr. President. I thought you had said, my parents just recently lost their health insurance, and I thought you said that if you liked the health insurance you have, you'd get to keep it. And I wonder, what you would say to people like my parents. Well, again, Obama is very seldom speechless, but you could look at him, and he was quite taken aback by this. He wasn't quite sure what he was going to say. And right when he was about to open his mouth, the recess bell went off. And the kids scrambled outside, and, the president was standing there talking to the teachers. And 15 minutes later, the kids reassemble, and the president says, "Where was I? Oh, yes, I was taking some questions from the children. Are there any questions?" Well, this little girl in the front of the room raises her hand, and the president says, "Young lady, what's your name?" She says, "Well, Mr. President, my name is Grace." "Well, Grace, what is your question this morning?" And she says, "Well, I have two questions, Mr. President. First, why did the recess bell go off 15 minutes early this morning? And my second question for you, Mr. President, is, what the hell happened to Oliver?" That's called executive privilege, right? Anyway, I am here to talk a little bit about what's going on with the economy, what's happening in a lot of the states, and kind of my prognosis for what's ahead. And obviously, a lot has changed in the last 7 days. We've had a pretty momentous election where Republicans swept all over the country. You have now more Republican governors than ever before, including here in the state of Arkansas. Republicans now will probably end up with 53 or 54 senators. And you've probably got across the country somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 to 350 newly elected Republican state legislators. So the country turned red on election day in 2014. The Republicans didn't do so well in 2012, so we keep kind of swinging back and forth. I do think that this is kind of a positive development for the economy, that you're going to have some more restraints on maybe some of the negative things that have happened in Washington. And quite frankly, I do think you're going to see some positive developments on some of the kind of pro-growth pro-business things that have to happen, like I think we're going to get the Keystone Pipeline built. I do think there's a decent chance we might finally see a rational reform on our corporate tax system. We can't go forward with the highest corporate tax in the world. I think everyone in this room knows that it's a kind of a Head Start program for every other country that we compete with. So I'm very hopeful we're going to see some marginal changes to policy in Washington that will be very positive. And I think a lot of these states, including Arkansas, have an awesome opportunity right now to make some incredible pro-growth changes that will make your state grow at an even faster rate. So as I talk about the economy, let me start by saying this, that if you look at the U.S. economy over the last 5 or 6 years, most of you know this, but one industry in particular has really driven our economy forward, so much so that without this industry, there wouldn't really be much of an expansion at all. And the industry, of course, that I'm talking about is the oil and gas industry. We are living through right now the biggest oil and gas boom in the history of this country. We've never seen anything like what has happened in the last 6 or 7 years. And by the way, this is a development that was really not due to the fact that all of a sudden we were endowed with all this oil and gas. The oil and gas has been here for hundreds of thousands of years. What's happened is through American technological prowess and entrepreneurship and just incredible know-how and technological improvement, we have improved our drilling practices so much that we have now become the major oil and gas producer in the world. And I wanted to show you just a couple of charts. If you could put up if you wouldn't mind putting up the this just gives you a sense of what's going on here and why this oil and gas boom is such a pro-America development. If you look at the red line, you're looking at all employment in the United States since the beginning of the Great Recession in 2008. And as you can see, that red line shows we lost about 7 million jobs during the terrible recession, and it's been a kind of slow go to recover those jobs. This goes through the end of 2013. If I updated that through 2014, in November of 2014, we're right back about where we started from. So that means that we finally recovered every lost job that was lost during the recession. It took a long time, but we're finally there. But we're basically at a situation of net zero over that period. And then you look at the blue line, and you can see what is happening with that incredible oil and gas boom, where essentially without this industry, there would be no net improvement in employment at all. That's a beautiful picture to behold, isn't it? And it's something that nobody would have predicted. It's interesting because I do travel all over this great country. And, the state in the United States, I think most of you know what state in America today has the lowest unemployment rate. It's North Dakota, right? How many of you knew that North Dakota had the lowest unemployment? Most of you do. North Dakota's unemployment rate today is 2.5% officially, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I'm here to tell you that's a bald-faced lie. The real unemployment rate in North Dakota is negative. That is to say there are about 15,000 unfilled jobs in North Dakota. That is to say that they need people to move to North Dakota to fill these energy jobs. And it's amazing. How many of you, by the way, have ever been to North Dakota? I had never been to North Dakota. I went there 2 years ago. I got to tell you, folks, it feels like in North Dakota what it must have been like during the gold rush era in California in the mid-19th century. I mean, this little town of Williston, North Dakota I went to, they don't even know what the population. It used to be a little town of wheat farmers of maybe 6,000 people. Then it was 10,000, 15, 20, 25,000 people in this town. It's so booming so fast, I had to spend $329 to stay at a Best Western hotel because literally there's no way to stay where to stay there. And this is basically this development because of technology. They now, I really get into this, but we now have the technological capacity, and these are made in America innovations, where they can now drill 2 miles deep into the ground. And then because of this incredible invention called horizontal drilling, these oil rigs now can go in any direction like a spider web, which makes them incredibly more productive and efficient. And then this other, massive new technological improvement is hydraulic fracturing, right, or fracking, which has been an amazing technology where you're able to crack through this shale oil and rock. And by the way, all this new energy production, so much of it is shale oil and gas. That's where it's coming from. And they're able to crack through this oil, this really thick, dense shale rock and get at the oil and gas. And it's just an amazing thing to behold. And the reason I bring up North Dakota is because, ladies and gentlemen, you want a pro-America story. There is more oil and gas today in North Dakota than there is in Saudi Arabia. That's a pretty amazing thing to think about. And it's not just happening in North Dakota. It's happening all over this great country of ours. Texas, in the last 6 years, has almost tripled its oil output. Oklahoma has doubled its oil output. Arkansas is becoming an energy-producing state, a wonderful thing to behold. Out east, where I live, we've got the Marcellus Shale. The Marcellus Shale has 150 years worth of natural gas. It's 150 years worth of this stuff in states like West Virginia and Pennsylvania and Ohio and New York. It's an amazing thing to behold. Now, the reason I tell you this is I believe this energy revolution that we're talking about is a complete game changer for our economy. We're way ahead technologically of the rest of the world. We're way ahead of Russia. We're way ahead of Saudi Arabia. We're way ahead of the OPEC nations in terms of getting at this gas and oil. I mean, it's just as recently as 2 or 3 years ago, the president was running around the country saying, we have to invest in wind and solar power and these renewable energy sources because we're running out of oil and gas. And what I'm here to tell you today, and what I'd tell the president if he were today, is simply this. Mr. President, America isn't running out of oil and gas. America is running into it, and in a big, big way. Now, here's why this is such an exciting story for not just the areas that have a lot of this oil and gas, but for the United States as a whole. If you think about this, if we are able to move forward in a very aggressive way with our drilling technologies, by building the pipelines we need, drilling on federal lands, all of this energy development that I've been talking about has been happening on private lands. We've got a lot of this oil and gas under federal lands, and if we could drill for that, we could increase our oil and gas exports incredibly so. So I want to make this statement to you because I think it's important. By the year 2020, which is only, 6 years from now, the United States of America, this great, great country of ours, is going to move from being an oil and gas import country to an oil and gas export country. Now, that's huge because today we spend $300 billion a year importing this stuff, buying this stuff oftentimes from countries that hate us, right? From countries like Saudi Arabia, from countries like Iran, from countries like Venezuela. Think what a game changer it is, not just for our economy, by the way, but also for our national security, if we're able to sell this stuff rather than having to buy it. I don't know how many of you saw the story just a couple of weeks ago that ISIS, these terrorists, these barbaric terrorists who are trying to kill us, they get $5 million a day from petrodollars. So we're funding the very people who are trying to kill us. That makes no sense. If we move forward with this oil and gas development, we can be energy independent. But I want to go even further than that and even make a bolder proclamation. I believe it's certainly within our grasp, when you look at the energy resources we have in this country, oil, gas, coal, nuclear, and others, that within the next 5 or 6 years, not only will the United States be energy independent, I will predict to you that for 5 or 6 years, the United States of America will be the energy dominant country in the world. And that is an awesome thing to behold. Now, I want to show you, if you put up the next chart, please. If you look at the second panel here, you can also see where the energy production is coming from. The red line is renewable energy. This is mostly wind and solar power. We've spent a lot of money at the federal level, about $80 billion nurturing that industry. It hasn't been a very good high payoff investment, as you can see. We haven't increased renewable energy very much. Meanwhile, oil and gas, which gets very little subsidy, look at what has happened there. It's an amazing thing. We were talking at breakfast this morning with the governor-elect, and I told him, and he was kind of amazed by this. If you look at, even despite all of the money we've spent on solar power and wind power over the last 6 or 7 years, today in the United States, the percentage of our electricity production in the country as a whole that comes from wind and solar power is 3%. 3%. So what I'm telling you is, if we're going to be serious as a manufacturing and industrial power, as we are, if we're going to continue to move forward with our $18 trillion industrial economy, we're not going to do that with windmills, right? We're going to do it by being a major source in fossil fuels. And look, we have to do this in an environmentally sensitive way. There's no question about it. I certainly agree with my green friends who say we have to do this in a way that keeps our water and air clean. But we can do this, right? We can keep our air and water clean and become the energy dominant country. And that's just a really good news story. And I want to just add one quick point about this. Randy asked me to talk a little bit about, whether the United States could be a manufacturing powerhouse. And I'm here to tell you we are becoming a manufacturing powerhouse right now as we sit here. And one of the great stories about this recovery, to the extent we've had one, is that it's kind of underappreciated. America right now is going through a manufacturing renaissance today. We're building things again. We're making things again here in the United States. We're making cars. We're making steel. I mean, they're opening up steel plants in Ohio again. Youngstown, Ohio, where it used to be a ghost town, they're reopening steel plants in a town like Youngstown, Ohio. You see the manufacturing that's going on here in this great state of Arkansas. And one of the things I'd like to to connect the dots here, one of the reasons the United States is becoming super competitive in terms of manufacturing is, guess what country in the world has the lowest energy prices? We do. The United States does. We have the lowest electric power costs of any country that we compete with. And that's because of this oil gas boom that has lowered the price of energy. If you look at what's happened to the gasoline price, you're feeling it here in Arkansas, I'm feeling it in Virginia, my home state. We've seen about a 30 to 40 cent decline in the price of gasoline in just the last 3 months. And I'm predicting we're going to probably see another 10 and 20 cent reduction in gas prices. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's a massive tax cut for the American consumer, right? Every time the price of gasoline falls, that means people have to pay obviously less money at the pump for gasoline, and it means they have more money to spend on all the other products and services that many of you in this room produce. So it's a very positive development, and we are becoming, one of the things I like to say is when people ask me about what is the forecast for the U.S. economy, the kind of cool thing about the U.S. economy right now that people don't fully appreciate is how productive and efficient American companies have become in this post-recession era. The way I put it on Fox News the other day is American companies, for the most part, not all American companies, most of the companies that you are all involved with, from Walmart to other great companies in America, American companies today are lean, mean fighting machines. They're incredibly efficient. They're incredibly productive. They are incredibly profitable. I mean, why have we seen this massive increase in the stock market over the last 5 or 6 years? I mean, incredible bull market expansion. Because of profits, right? Because American companies are profitable, almost ruthlessly so. In fact, what happened in the recession is when that recession hit and business conditions fell into the toilet, American companies laid off workers, they shed their least efficient production lines and so on, and they got healthy again. They retooled and re-engineered themselves in a very, very productive, pro-America way. All we need right now, in my opinion, to get this economy to ramp up into a higher gear is simply to get the government to just stay out of the way, right? If Washington would just stay out of the way and let American companies prosper, we would see a much faster recovery. Now, I want to show you, to sort of document this point, I want to show you a little bit about the potential for the U.S. economy that has been unrealized. I call this the growth gap. And look, this is going to seem like a very partisan point, and I have to confess at the outset, I worked for President Reagan, I worship the man, and so I have a special place in my heart for Ronald Reagan, but these are statistics that don't lie. And the way I like to put this, I show this to students who are trying to understand how economics works and how policy has an impact on how economies. I always put it like this. In the last 50 years, we have had 2 presidents in the United States who have entered office during periods of extreme economic crisis. The first president, of course, was Ronald Reagan. I mean, how many of you are old enough to remember in this room 14% inflation and 20% mortgage interest rates? And you look back at the economy back then in the late 70s and early 80s, the U.S. economy was in a complete period of crisis and decline. If you read what people were saying about America in the late 70s and 80s, they said Japan is going to overtake us as an economic superpower. The Soviet Union, they have the right model. We don't. Our capitalist system doesn't work anymore. People said that we were an empire in decline. So it was a terrible time. But of course, Barack Obama entered office in a period of great crisis. There's no denying that. As he says all the time, he walked into the Oval Office, America had lost 6 or 7 million jobs. We had the housing real estate bubble burst. We had banks that had major American banks that were in bankruptcy and so on. So it was a terrible time. What's interesting about this experiment is that there were these 2 kind of very diametrically opposite economic programs that were put in place to deal with the crisis. So under Ronald Reagan, you all know this because we lived all through this. What did Ronald Reagan do? Well, the first thing he did was he cut tax rates to make the economy grow faster. He and Paul Volcker, who was the Fed chairman at that time, got control of money, so we reduced the money supply to get control of inflation. We cut government spending. In sum, the Reagan philosophy was the government is the problem, not the solution. We cut government and let the great American companies and great American workers rebuild this economy, and boy, did they do so. under President Obama, and look, I'm not here to criticize the president, but I think some of his economic policies have been very questionable. And so what have we done in the last 6 years? Well, the first thing we did was we had massive bailouts of failed institutions. Some of you in this room may think that was the right thing to do. We had a big argument about that back in the day when I was at the Wall Street Journal, but I'm not a big believer in bailing out failed companies. We had $830 billion fiscal stimulus bill, or so-called stimulus bill, that was going to create, 4 million jobs through government spending. We had Obamacare. We had tax increases on the rich. And of course, we've had the Fed massively infuse the economy with money. Then you ask the question, okay, which of these models worked better? We've had these two models side by side. Which one worked and which one didn't? And if you look at this chart, what this is telling you is that we've had about a 2% growth path in this recovery under President Obama, and we had a 4% growth path under Reagan in the same period of recovery. Why does this matter? Because if you look at that chart, that $1.9 trillion number, what that means, ladies and gentlemen, is if the economy had grown as quickly over the last 5.5 years under President Obama as it did under Ronald Reagan, the U.S. economy would be almost $2 trillion larger today. We'd have $2 trillion more output. Think about that, what that would mean for jobs. Think about what that would mean for incomes. If we had $2 trillion more income today as a nation, and we prorated that to every family in America, that means every family in America would have $15,000 more income. It's a gigantic number. And by the way, in this recovery, the American family has not recovered $15,000 of income. They don't have $15,000 more income. The average American family, the median family in America today, since the start of the recovery in June of 2009, has $1,500 less income. $1,500 less. There was a poll that was taken 3 days before the midterm elections by ABC News, and they asked the American people this question. Do you think America is still in a recession? Do you think America is still in a recession? 52% of Americans said yes to that. 52%. Now, look, I'm not trying to downgrade the American economy. I'm bullish on the future. But when you have half of Americans who think we're still in a recession, what that is telling us is that this recovery hasn't touched a lot of families. They are incredibly economically anxious right now. They're angry. They are not feeling the love of this expansion because they haven't felt it yet. And the point is, if we get back to these kinds of basic ABC policies that President Reagan put in place, the potential of this economy is almost unlimited. I want to just shift gears then and talk a little bit about, I'll skip this one. And I'll just show you this because I think what's happening in the States is so important. And, it was mentioned that I have this new book out called The Wealth of the States. And this is really one of the big stories of America that is not getting enough attention, which is what's happening in these states, and you all know this living in Arkansas, is we're living through a massive migration, one of the great migrations, internal migrations in American history, which is people are moving from the Northeast and the Midwest, and they're moving to the South, and they're moving to the Sun Belt area. And we see this day after day after day. In fact, I would make the case to you that this is accelerating. And America, quite frankly, is now being bifurcated into two nations, essentially, blue states and red states. Blue states and red states. And it's interesting what happened here in Arkansas because, what is it? I think, Randy, you were saying for the first time in 100 years, Republicans now have the governorship, the House, and the Senate. So this state has now become essentially a red state, as most of the other southern states have become. And what's happening is people are moving out of these blue states into these red states because of policy. I'll just tell you one kind of funny story. I was in Jackson, Mississippi about a month ago, and I showed people this graph, and I said, what I'm trying to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, I have to say I got a little carried away. I said, what I'm telling you, and I pounded my fist on the podium, and I said, the South will rise again. People got so excited and they started dancing in their seats, and these people in the back of the room were, shouting. And this one guy shouted at me, he said, Mr. Moore, do you mean militarily? And I said, no, not militarily. But the point I'm making is we are seeing this kind of new civil war is an economic civil war. And the South is winning this war because you're doing most of the things right. And the way I like to demonstrate why policy matters, I know there are a lot of members here in the House and the Senate and some of the newly elected people, policy matters. Policy matters a lot about where the economic development in this country happens. And so I like to show this chart because it turns out that we have 4 states in the United States that really are the big drivers of the U.S. economy. Texas, Florida, California, and New York. And those 4 states, 1 in 3 Americans lives in those states. So how those states do economically matters a lot for the nation as a whole. And as fate would have it, 2 of those states, Texas and Florida, are red states, right? And 2 of them are blue states. And by the way, I'll just pose a question to you all. Anybody in this room tell me what the income tax rate in Texas and Florida is? 0, right? I think you all know that, being a neighboring state of Texas. In California and New York, by the way, these are states that are deep blue. You know, there are no Republicans in California and New York. They're like the opposite of Arkansas. The Republicans are an endangered species in California and New York. In fact, these states went more Democratic in the last election, whereas the rest of the nation went in the other direction. Now, why that is important is if you look at this chart, by the way, the highest income tax rate in California and New York, the highest income tax rate now in these 2 states is 13.5%. So that means you can move out of California and New York to a state like Texas or Tennessee or Florida or New Hampshire or Wyoming and pay 0. That's a big deal. That's a big savings people make. Does it matter? Liberals say, no, none of this stuff matters. You're going to hear this all the time as you do tax reform, and I hope that is a top priority here in Arkansas. You're going to hear liberals say, no, that doesn't matter whether you fix your tax system. It matters. And this shows you this in spades. What this is showing you is that over the last 15 years, for every job that was created in California and New York, 3 jobs were created in Texas and Florida. Now, do you all know, anybody in this room, do you all know this guy, Paul Krugman? He's kind of a liberal economist. He writes for this left-wing rag called the New York Times. And, he's just doesn't have his tray table in the upright and locked position when it comes to a lot of this stuff. And I was debating him a couple of months ago about this very subject. And I showed him this chart and I said, Paul, you have a Nobel Prize in economics. You write twice a week for the New York Times. Everybody listens to you. I said, these 2 states, California and New York, they've done everything you've told them to do, right? They have high minimum wages. They have high taxes on rich people. They have anti-drilling policies. They don't like fracking. They regulate all their industries and so on. And you said this was going to create a workers' paradise, right? Everybody's going to be in these states because they do all of these things that are pro-consumer and pro-worker. And then I said, but Paul, if that's the case, why are people leaving these states and going to states like Texas and Florida? Well, he gets up there, he's a very arrogant guy, and he responds to me, he says, Steve, there's a very easy explanation for this. It has nothing to do with policy. He said the reason that people are leaving the Northeast and going to the South is because of the weather. Now, we chuckle at that. But there's as with everything Paul Krugman writes and says, there's always this small kernel of truth surrounded by a cloud of misinformation. It is absolutely true that as we become an older nation, and baby boomers retire, they're going to want to move to Phoenix, Arizona, and they're going to want to move to Fort Lauderdale. They're going to want to live in Myrtle Beach and places like that, no question about it. But then I zinged him. I think you'll love this. So I said, well, Paul, that's a really interesting theory that people are leaving because of the weather. I said, well, if that's the case, maybe you can tell me then, why is it that people are leaving San Diego and they're moving to Houston? Because nobody moves from San Diego to Houston for the weather. And his response was, he had no response to that because there is none. Policy does matter. Now, I thought I'd show you one other thing on these states, if you'd show the next chart. And this shows you where the states are in terms of our analysis of where they are headed. And gosh, I can't even, what number is Arkansas on this chart? Yeah, so you're doing okay, but there's a lot of room for improvement. What this is saying is there's a lot of upside potential in Arkansas if you could cut your income tax. I was meeting with my good friend Dan Greenberg this morning. I think that the whole idea of tort reform in this state is hugely important. I agree with them. If you do some of the basic things that should be done in Arkansas, you're going to move up that scale and you're going to become a high-octane state. Look, by the way, at the states that are at the bottom of this list, the states that, and we've been doing this for 7 years. You got New York, you got California, you got my home state of Illinois, Vermont, New Jersey. Those states just get everything wrong. You should be taking jobs away from those states, and they should be coming to great cities like Little Rock. Now, if you'll show the next chart, this just shows you the potential if you get things right. Look at the Texas story. I'm not here to boast about Texas, but you do compete with Texas being a neighboring state. And if you look at that purple line, that's all employment in the United States. If you look at the blue line, that's employment in Texas. And look at that. You take Texas out of the nation, and we've had no net employment over the last 5.5 years. Texas accounts on net for every new job that was created in this country. What I take away from this is what we want to do is make America, and we want to make Arkansas look more like Texas and less like New York. Right, and that's the challenge I would put to all the state lawmakers in this room. On the next chart, I'm going to skip ahead and just make a couple of just, I think, important points that especially for the lawmakers here who are going to be guiding this great state over the next 2 and 4 and 6 years. Tax rates matter, and they matter a whole heck of a lot. And I love to show this chart. This is on the federal level, but I think it's instructive for states too. If you look at that green line, that's the highest income tax rate in the United States over the last 50 years. Some of you are maybe old enough to remember in the 1970s, if you look at that chart, you can see the highest income tax rate in the United States was 70%. That meant for every additional dollar you were making, 70 cents went to the government and only 30 cents got to stay with the individual investor or worker. And God bless Ronald Reagan and Jack Kemp, and the Wall Street Journal editorial page back then was saying those tax rates are so high, they're leading to investment outside of the United States or investment in tax shelters other than goods producing and manufacturing types of entities. And so you can see what Reagan did. He came in, you know the story. He cut the top tax rate from 70% down to 50%, and then a few years later, we cut the top rate from 50 to 28%. Ladies and gentlemen, that was a big deal, right? That meant at the beginning of the era, you got to keep 30 cents after tax on the dollar. When the rate fell to 28%, we got to keep 72 cents on the dollar. So the after-tax rate of return in the United States was more than doubled over that period. It's not too surprising we saw a big boom. Now you can see the rates went up a little bit under President Clinton. They went down a little bit under George W. Bush. They've gone up a little bit under Barack Obama. But here's the interesting thing. Look at that brown line. That brown line is the share of taxes paid by the richest 1% in America. Now, this is an amazing chart, isn't it? It's counterintuitive. What this is telling us is, as the green line went down, the tax rate went down. Look at what happened to the share of taxes paid by the top 1%. Went up. Who are those people? I mean, Warren Buffett and Bill Gates and Tiger Woods and Hannah Montana and evil people like that, right? I mean, they ended up paying more tax, not less. There's a lesson there, right? And it's a lesson that John F. Kennedy taught us 50 years ago. And I just have to read you this because I feel so passionately about this. And John F. Kennedy nailed it. He said this just a few months before he was so tragically assassinated. He said, "It is a paradoxical truth that tax rates are too high today and tax revenues are too low." This is the part I love. "The soundest way to raise the revenues in the long run is to cut the rates now." That's good advice for Arkansas, right? I believe if you cut your tax rates, you can get more revenues, not less. And of course, the same thing is true at the federal level. I want to go back and just show you something, if I may. I skipped over this, but I think it's important. This is the stock market over the last 50 years. And I just wanted to show you. You can see the green line, the blue line is the S&P 500, the green line is the S&P 500 adjusted for inflation. But what's interesting about this chart, look at the green line, because you all know when you make an investment, you're interested in your after inflation, not before inflation rate of return. You can see what happened in the 1970s. The 1970s was the worst period for the U.S. stock market and for the U.S. economy since the Great Depression. What that's saying is from 1969 to 1982, stocks lost almost 2/3 of their value relative to inflation. I think we can all agree that when you have 2/3 of, a loss of equity values of 2/3 over a 12-year period in real terms, that is a ferocious bear market. And then you can see, the way I like to put it is that the clouds over America finally dispersed, the sun came out, and God gave America Ronald Reagan, right? And you can see, look at that blue line, look at the blue line, look at the massive increase in wealth in this country in the 1980s and 1990s. What you're looking at there, ladies and gentlemen, is the greatest period of wealth creation in the history of civilization. No, and by the way, that didn't just happen under Ronald Reagan, it accelerated under Arkansas, our president from Arkansas, Bill Clinton. Those were incredibly bullish, productive years for the economy. It proves we can get things done when you have a Democrat in office if he believes in the free enterprise system. My point of showing you this is that's what we need to do. That's the potential for the U.S. economy. Let's get back on that high growth kind of ascent where you're creating 400,000, 500,000 jobs a month, as we did over that period. Do you know, under Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton as president, the United States created 45 million jobs. We can do that again. That's what I'm here to tell you. If we get these policies right, we can do this again and avoid look at the last 10 years. It's just been nothing. We had the big collapse in the market in 1999 and 2000. And then, of course, you see the big collapse that happened with the real estate crisis. We're pretty much right back where we started. We have to get back to the policies that create sustained growth. I'm going to show you one or two other things. This was a mistake we made. We raised taxes a few years ago. People forget about this, but it's important to remember that all of these taxes on investment and businesses went up. This was a dumb thing to do. If you want more investment, you want to lower taxes. There's an old saying by Milton Friedman, if you tax something, you get less of it. If you tax something less, you get more of it. We know that. So why would we raise tax on dividends, capital gains, and small businesses, which is what we did in the year 2013? I think that should be reversed, or let's even go to something really dramatic like a flat tax or some kind of sales tax. You want to see growth in this economy, we ought to do that. A couple of other last points I want to make to you. That's the new, this is the new simple tax form that is being talked about in Washington. Very simple postcard return, right? Can't get much easier than that. I wanted to just quickly show you a couple of other things I think are really important. I'll touch on this. I mean, I know that monetary policy can be a boring subject, and Steve Forbes used to tell me, the bane of my existence is, because I'm traveling all the time, is to get stuck in the middle seat of an airplane. I just won't do it anymore. I'm too old for that. And so I was complaining to my friend Steve Forbes about this, and I said, Steve, I got on another middle seat of an airplane. He told me, I've got a great way you can avoid that from happening in the future. He said, whenever I get stuck on the middle seat of an airplane, what I do is start talking about monetary policy, and it clears out the whole row. So I know this can be a boring subject, but I just want to show you this, because if you want to understand the economy, you got to understand this. You can see the big increase in inflation in the 70s, and then you can see what happened when Reagan and Volcker came in, and they cut the inflation rate from 14 to about 4%. And then over the next 25 years, we've had a very level, stable price system. That's one of the things that has really helped our economy grow. And if you look at the very end of this, you can see that inflation now is running at about 1.9 or 2%, the lowest rates of inflation we've had in 50 years. Now, the reason that's surprising is because of this. Most of you have seen this chart, but this is what we've done with our money supply. We've massively increased the amount of money that's being, flowing into the economy under Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen. And the QE1s, QE2s, QE3s. And what this is showing you is that over the last 6 or 7 years, we've flushed about $3.5 trillion of paper money into the U.S. economy. In fact, the amount of dollars in the economy today is about twice what it was going back to 2007. Now, if I showed you this chart, ladies and gentlemen, and I didn't even tell you what country this was, and you saw this chart and this massive inflow of money, what would you think was happening in this country? Inflation, right? But we're not seeing inflation because the money hasn't gotten spent. And one of the big concerns that I have about the economy, that whether we can thread this needle, whether we can put this genie back in the bottle, I think it's something that keeps a lot of us up at night, right? Can we get control of our money supply so we don't see a big burst of inflation as we see in many other countries that try this tactic? It's interesting. I'll just show you one other picture on this economic situation. You want to see a beautiful picture of the U.S. economy, look at the interest rate story in the economy over the last 40 or 50 years. You see the big increase in inflation in the 60s and 70s, and then starting in 81, 82, it's just been down, right? So much so that right now the 10-year Treasury bill is selling at a 2.3% interest rate. You can get, where I live in Virginia, I don't know what they are in Arkansas, you can now get a 30-year mortgage at a 4% interest rate. That's an amazingly low rate. By the way, Randy, if you're nice enough to have me back, let's say 5 years from now, I'm willing to bet any or all takers in this room, $100 to any or all of you, that 5 years from now, interest rates are going to be higher than they are today. Anybody want to take me up on that? It's not a very bold bet, right? Because they can hardly go any lower than they are today. By the way, this is one of the things that's really keeping the economy going is those low interest rates. But in 2011 and 12, this is something I thought was mathematically impossible. This is the real interest rate. The real interest rate is the interest rate minus the inflation rate. In 2011 and 2012, interest rates went negative. real. That is to say, people were buying 10-year Treasury bills. Just for those of you who are not economists to understand what a negative real interest rate means, it means Americans and foreigners, everybody around the country, everybody in this room, everybody around the world was buying 10-year Treasury bills, and the federal government was promising people who bought those bonds in 10 years they would pay them back less money than they lent to them in the first place. That is extreme risk aversion, and that's one of the things that's been holding back the economy. The good news is you can see the real interest rate has been starting to rise. What that means to me is people are finally, that cloak of fear is finally starting to be lifted over the U.S. economy. It's one of the reasons I'm really bullish. If I may make one or two other points, I have to show you this because I think it is so important to understand the industries that are so dysfunctional in America today that are holding back growth. This is the change in prices of major industries over the last 10 or 12 years. And you can see that if you look at basic consumer items, if you look at things like new vehicles, cars and trucks, apparel, software, computers, those things have been falling in price. That's an incredibly pro-consumer thing. It makes Americans' living standards higher when things fall in price. And I want to say this, I have to say this, even though I'm not sucking up to Walmart, but I have to say this. Walmart has been one of the greatest antidotes to poverty in the history of the world, right? I mean, what you do at Walmart is provide people with things that they can afford. I mean, you go into Walmart today, you can get damn near anything you need for 99 cents. It's unbelievable what you all do at Walmart. But those are the kinds of things, you see that in these figures. Walmart and other great companies like Home Depot and others are holding back prices. Now look at the other industries though, take out energy, because this doesn't include the big boom we've seen with prices falling. Look at the other two industries, ladies and gentlemen, prices were through the roof where we can't control inflation. Education and healthcare. Education and healthcare. What do those two industries have in common? Government, right? These are the two industries that are most dominated by government. And I would make the case if we want these to become more efficient industries, wouldn't it be a wonderful thing if we have Walmart schools and Walmart healthcare and things like that? I mean, why is it that those prices are rising out of control? This is relevant to those of you who are state lawmakers in this room. We have got to get control of these education costs. Do not measure how well your schools are doing by how much you spend. We've got to be results-oriented. How many of you in this room have a son or daughter in college today? Raise your hand. About half of you do. I have two sons in college. My oldest son, I've just got to tell you one, by point of personal privilege, a story about my son. He is, and right now, a senior at Northwestern University, which is outside of Chicago. My tuition that I am paying today, room, board, and tuition at Northwestern, $62,500 a year. 62, ladies and gentlemen, that's thievery. That's stealing, right? How do they get away with charging that much money? When my son was going off to college, I'll never forget, he's packing his bags. I go up to the room, I sit next to him on the bed. It's a very emotional day when your kid goes off to college. Hopefully he'll never come back, right? And I said to him, Justin, I made a promise to you that when you were a little kid, I would pay your tuition and room and board for 4 years, and then you're on your own financially. And I'm here to tell you I'm going to honor that commitment. But I said, I want to make a deal with you before you leave. I said, you can go to Northwestern for 4 years. I'll pay the full freight. Or I'm willing and able to write you a check right now for $200,000. You can play computer games for 4 years, and we'll both be better off. He said, yeah, that sounded pretty good to him. I mean, we have to really wonder, is college worth $200,000 or $150,000 a year? That's a bubble that has to burst, right? And hopefully things like online education will. And the same thing with healthcare. I mean, I would love to see, I know Medicaid is a big issue here in Arkansas, and how are you going to deal with Obamacare? There are so many ways of more efficiently providing universal healthcare to people than Obamacare. We can do this. We can use market mechanisms to provide quality health care for everyone in America at a lower cost, and I would love to see Arkansas be a model for that. Finally, there's the issue of why am I so bullish on the economy? And I want to just say this, as I promise this is my last point. It's the digital age. It's this technological revolution that is pervading everything that happens in America. And it is such an awesome story of intellectual know-how. I mean, I talked about the oil industry. This is all being driven by technology. And the way I like to relate this to people, because people don't really appreciate the incredible improvements in our lives in just the last 10 or 20 or 30 years, especially young people. I mean, I go to these college campuses, these kids are so dour and dire, and they're like, oh my God, why do I have to be alive now? It's so terrible, and the polar ice caps are melting and all that stuff. And I say, you can't, look, Look at this. What this is measuring is how fast these technologies change our lives. Telephones, when the telephone was first invented, that 71 number there, that's telling you that it took 71 years from the time the telephone was first invented to the time the average American could afford a telephone. 71 years, that's 3 generations it took. Electricity, from the time, J.P. Morgan and the Carnegies and the Rockefellers had electricity in their home till the time the average American could have electricity in their home, that took 50 years, a half a century. For radios, it's 30 years, TVs, 20 years. Look at the modern age, look at these things. Half of these things we don't have any more: VCR, CD players, cell phones. What's happening right now, and this is so pro-growth and pro-consumer and pro-poor people, is that as soon as these things are invented, Americans have them. They become almost instantly affordable. You see, I'll just give you one example. This chart shows you everything. Look at that. Look at that. And what movie is that? Wall Street. That's, for those of you who have not seen this movie, that's Michael Douglas playing the part of Gordon Gekko. Gordon Gekko is the rich fat cat on Wall Street, right? Look at that thing he's holding. It's like a brick with an antenna coming out of it, right? Now here is the amazing thing, and Randy, you can't answer this because I know you know the answer. Anybody want to guess what that thing cost in 1987? $4,600. $4,600. Now they damn near give these things away for free, right? I mean, I just got one of these new smartphones. My kids got it for me for my birthday. This is like, these smartphones are unbelievable. You just talk to it. It tells you anything. It tells you where to go and stuff. It has cameras, GPS, and So the first question I asked my smartphone is, will you marry me? You know what I said? I think we should date first. I mean, these are really, really smart phones. Anyway, this is my story, that as we get these policies right, and I will end with this, if we start to tweak these dials in a pro-growth direction in Arkansas and in the nation as a whole, fix the tax system here, make it as pro-growth as possible. My God, I'm going to say something, outrageous. I would like to see Arkansas become the 10th state in this country that has no income tax at all. No income tax at all. I mean, you want to see growth in this state? Let's get rid of the income tax. You can do it. But if we move to a flat tax or a fair tax or something like that in Washington, if we get rid of some of these regulatory controls of the economy, and quite frankly, if we just shift attitudinally, in Washington especially, about business. What Hillary Clinton said, a couple of weeks ago, I think we all agree was imbecilic, right? When she said businesses and corporations don't create jobs. And she may have misspoke. I mean, she didn't look like she misspoke. But the point is, there's an attitude in Washington that is so anti-business. It's like when Barack Obama said, you didn't build that, to those businessmen. We need people in Washington who support business, who are pro-profits, who are pro-production, who are pro-manufacturing. And just that kind of attitudinal shift, I think, can create a great boon in this country. And I'm going to say this. Once we get those policies fixed, and I think we will in the next 2 or 3 or 4 years, once we start to see those policies moved in the right direction, ladies and gentlemen, America is going to see the biggest boom it's ever seen. Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure to be with you.